Hello, friends. Welcome to Minority Trip Report. MTR is a podcast for underrepresented views and life journeys with mental health, psychedelics, and consciousness. I'm your host, Raj Suraj. Today, my guest is Ruby Singh, who is a multi-award-winning composer and producer residing on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Selilwitulh Nations. His creativity crosses the boundaries of music, poetry, photography, and film, all art forms that engage with mythos, memory, justice, and fantasy. In 2022, he received the Lieutenant Governor's Jubilee Award for Excellence in Art and Music. Singh believes in art's ability to reimagine futures and repurpose aesthetic freedoms towards civil and environmental justice. Ruby, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Rod. It's good to be here.
So you and I met a couple of weeks ago on Cortez Island, friend of ours, Kim Haxton. And when people say there's a vibe, and right away there was a vibe. And we shared many beautiful moments on Cortez Island, and I'm really grateful that you decided to join me on the podcast.
I'm really grateful for the invitation, and I'm also very grateful to Kim Haxton for hooking us up and missing us.
Absolutely. So Kim gets a second shout out because she was our first guest on the podcast. So Kimmy, thank you.
Yeah, sweet.
So let's dive right in. So Ruby, you call yourself Ruby Singh. That is your artist moniker. That is the name that most of your fans and friends know you as. But your ancestral name is different. So let's start there. What is your ancestral name, your birth name? And then what was it like to grow up in Canada with that name?
Right. So my ancestral name is Rupinder Singh Sidhu. And I think it was actually pretty early on that my family started calling me Ruby. All of us have like these official Sikhi names that are given to us, and then we have these family names as well. And so Ruby was what I was called from a young age at home, but in the world, I went as actually Rup for a long time, especially at school, because Rupinder was like white tongues weren't curving around that. So Rupinder, I think, is the worst that happened to it. Yeah, I was the first of my family born on Turtle Island. I was born in southern Alberta in traditional blood territories there. And we lived that migration story here in Canada as well, where I was born in southern Alberta, spent the first 4 years of my life there. And then I went off to live with my uncle I think he was in maybe Mississauga at that time, then came back to Cranbrook, BC, then back to Brampton and Rexdale, and then back to Abbotsford, BC. And that's where I spent my high school years. And for the past 25 years now, I've called Vancouver home. It's been the home base.
Wow. So you did the whole Western GTA circuit then.
Definitely. rolling around, having asthma attacks on bikes, trying to get between places.
So which part of the country did you relate to? Because it sounds like you traveled a lot. Did certain place call out to you more than the others?
Yeah, I would definitely say the West Coast grew me up. You know what I mean? I would say like the lands out here really are the ones that speak home to me. Whenever I've gone on longer travels abroad, even back home to India and coming back, there's always a sense of finding home when I return and I smell the ocean and I see the mountains. This is the kind of land that I think understands me the most and that I understand the most.
What does that mean? That it understands you the most and you understand the most. What about the land?
I think in large part, us as humans, we like to separate ourselves off into our little ego identities and how we are like these individuals with this career or that. And I think in my heart of hearts and my truth of truths, I see us as interdependent beings, interwoven in a tapestry of life that has existed for millennia upon millennia and will continue to exist for millennia upon millennia. We're already getting out there, Rod. That's really what it means to me, is that we are in relationship to the world around us. We are not these singular entities floating about. And this matter of choice, this idea that we really direct our lives, I think is something that we fool ourselves with, because even we look at our own microbiology, there are how many billions of different just living on and in us that are helping us make these decisions. So I really feel like we are these interdependent, interwoven beings.
When did you first develop an understanding or awareness of spectral consciousness, for the lack of a better word?
I like that as a word myself, spectral consciousness. You know what this podcast is about? Psychedelics came into my life at a young age. And in a way, it did an interesting thing because it turned me towards the idea. My family's Sikhi, and Sikhi faith is what I grew up with. But I grew up here in Canada. I didn't understand Gurmukhi. I didn't understand what they were necessarily saying in the temple. And then when I first got into music as a late teens, early 20s, I went to study tabla at the local Sikh temple in Abbotsford. And one of the bubbas there would just like point at things and call them God, including like styrofoam containers that were in the garbage and other people and frames and seats and all these things. And so this idea of spectral consciousness really took me on a long trip back to the understandings of gurus from the 15th century. Guru Nanak Dev Ji, first words are in the Guru Granth Sahib are Ek Onkar, which like hard to translate, but to me it means that there's an interwoven resonance to everything. And so it's really interesting to think about the various psychedelic journeys that I've been on and how they've opened that up to me, and how that is also the roots of where we come from when we live in devotion as well. Yeah, so there's a really interesting correlation that I like to explore there.
Did you grow up feeling Sikh? What's your connection to your faith or your culture growing up?
I would say growing up, I was like one of those at a time where I would feel quite often as a teenager, I think I felt almost ashamed, if not trying to push it back, if not trying to anglicize myself more, if not trying to be different than who I was, or try and push those parts of my being away in order for some relevant acceptance into this white supremacy woven society that we live within. And I'd say it was probably in my early 20s where I started to decode and defragment and detach myself from those, I think, quite harmful beliefs, in all honesty. And it's really interesting for me to think about. At the time when I grew up in Abbotsford, I was one of like maybe 3 to 4 brown kids in the class. And then by the time my little brother, who's just 7 years younger than me, graduates from high school, most of his high school classes is Punjabi. They are having Punjabi days where they're rolling up in tractors. The cafeteria is serving Punjabi food. And it's like this, it's a celebration of who we are, as opposed to a constant mocking and a constant like trying to fit in. There wasn't that need for him to do that. He could come and celebrate who he was and all of who he was, which I think is an amazing movement.
Yeah, it's amazing how the world has changed. In some ways, maybe the art that comes from that is very different from the art that comes from the inner conflict that is generated because you're made to feel like you're otherized constantly. What I wanted to ask was, did that sense of tension or conflict, did you feel that, did it exist with you endogenously, or was it, you think it's because of the way other people saw you and how they made you feel?
I think it's probably a combination of both. You know what I mean? I feel like you as a teenager, you're trying to fit in. You're trying to like you got hormones running through you. You're trying to figure out what your purpose in life is. Also, you're trying to figure out why this like mad capitalist society is existing the way it's existing, and how we're like we are really in an experiment. There's no other time in history except for the last 100 years where we decided that we're going to divvy up generations and put them with each other, as opposed to have them integrated with the rest of the generations to be learning in cyclical ways from everybody, from children to grandparents. But instead we're like, hey, here's a great idea. Let's take all the teenagers who have crazy ass hormones going inside themselves and all sorts of issues around self and identity and stick them all together. So I think it's inevitable that like it's going to be a combination of both an internal struggle and external pressures.
Yeah, it's well said, right? Growing up, when I saw Western movies, and I grew up in Saudi Arabia, and so most of media at that time at least was fully censored, but every now and then things slip in, right?
Yeah.
And so you discover movies like American Pie, and I was like, how do you make sense of this? It's awesome on one hand because you're like 15 and girls, etc.
Totally.
On the other hand, there's this depiction of high school and all this insanity, and of course, like there's the opposite spectrum of the tone of American Pie, right? It's very dark, very lots of turmoil. But it's always wonder, why is high school like this? We had a high school experience that was also equally, let's just say, full of turmoil and tension, but not in the sort of way you see high school experiences depicted in the West. But to your point, it does make sense. You put all these crazy kids with all this sort of confusion, hormones, and of course, then you have media and all this stuff. It makes sense.
And then like class and how that plays out in it, the way that
Right,
class and race
right.
interacts. You're trying to go with fads and wear the like thing and like trying to attain this idea of cool that came out of some like 50s advertisement asshole in New York, trying to tell you how you're supposed, what like the way to be is. Like there's one way to be for everybody. And of course, I don't have that critique as a young person. As a young person, I'm just like, holy shit, I want what all the rich kids have. I want to try and fit in with them because they're the like quote unquote cool kids or whatever. And yeah, so I think it's just a bunch of insecurities playing out, and like and in all honesty, like from the rich kids to the poor kids to the brown kids to the white kids, I feel like high school is just a big play of insecurities.
A big melting pot of all the suffering and insecurities of all cultures. And
Yeah, totally.
Class is actually a really interesting one. I'm glad you brought that up, because nowhere does class become more obvious in a school than during lunchtime.
Word.
Right? When you see each kid bring out what they're eating and what kind of lunchbox they have, you're like,
oh, it's like that.
All right. And of course, there's lots of trauma that comes from that as well. You're the guy or the girl with the smelly food or whatever, and you get taunted for it. Or you're the person who doesn't have the fancy lunchbox and all the other sort of like bells and whistles around that stuff, right?
Totally.
It's such an interesting thing. But coming back to your Sikh ancestry, I think most of us, and I'm guilty of this as well, and I would love to learn more, is that without getting into, let's just say, the technicalities, I would love to know, what is the spiritual framework of Sikhism as a cultural, spiritual practice? Going back and thinking about it now, you touched on it a little bit. I'd love to know, I forgot the word that you mentioned.
Ek Onkar.
Yeah, so things like that, and kirtan and stuff like that. I would love to know, what is the overall spiritual framework? How do, let's say, practicing pious Sikhs, how do they see the world?
If I was a practicing pious Sikh, I might be able to tell you. So I will speak for myself in this, and any Sikhis tuning in, feel free to make comments and such, because I'm curious. I think each of us carries like a different way of relating. But from my understandings and like what for me has really resonated with me are the teachings that Guru Nanak brought, who is the founder of Sikhism. It's a setup. I think the kind of wider scope is that guruship was passed along to 10 gurus, and then that was finally turned into the living guru, which is the Guru Granth Sahib, which is the holy text, which is full of essentially poetry and hymns. And so art is at the center of it for me. And of course, that's the way that I see it, living as I do as an artist. But if you look at Guru Nanak, his life was, I think, pretty amazing. He traveled. He was accompanied by his Muslim homie who played rabab, and he would sing, and they would go get into all sorts of philosophical discussions with holy people. He migrated quite a distance. And, what I take away as the basic tenets of it, as one of the things that I admired about him, was that he was looking for a way to understand himself as a spiritual being in everyday life. Not a monk on a mountaintop, but somebody who was integrated in his family, in community, and how he should exist. And of course, within the context of Sikhi, one of the things that I look at is like, where are the women in the writing? Because we have 10 male gurus, and there's women all around them doing so much work and doing so much in lifting. And so one of the early things that I also love is around food and langar, which is that everybody is welcome at the table. Everybody's equal when they sit at the table. In fact, sit on the floor would be the situation. But that it was a space where no matter your belief, no matter your class, and that's the other thing that I actually really admired about it, was the idea of like really troubling class and caste and trying to eliminate those as strongholds in the social fabric of India at the time, and think of everybody as having a direct relationship with the divine, as opposed to it also having to go through a pandit or priest, that each individual was divine and could have a relationship with the divine.
Mm.
And that's all mashed in with poetry and music and hymns and shabads and kirtan and this way of being together. And for me, the essentiality of it is like most religions. Boil them all down. It's like, be a good person. Don't be an asshole. You know what I mean?
So
Like,
simple.
it's so simple. They really do break down. And there's, of course, farther levels of tenets and discipline and meditation. One of the things that I really love that shows up in some of my work through the time, especially looking at Guru Nanak's work, a couple of different things. One is the Amrit Vela, or the time for Amrit to pass through us is during the morning. And I love looking at this idea of I've been really looking at this idea of the dawn chorus and like how the world is rising and they rises in song. And that's a record that continues on and on around the planet. As the sun hits the earth, the birds erupt into song, the insects erupt into song. And we should also be erupting into song and bringing forth the day. And so that's one of the things that I love and I've been exploring recently in my artwork. And another piece of Guru Nanak's that really I came around to again is this interesting thing of finding the fractaling or the overlapping or weaving of what is this person from 500 some odd years ago falling in love with the night sky. I've always been in love with the night sky. And there's this particular piece by Guru Nanak called Arti that I explored with a group of musicians from Delhi and Dr. Madan Gopal Singh in particular, who's this beautiful man who works in translation of various Sufi works. And because if you're looking at that time, there's a poetic renaissance happening in the area around music and literature. And that is another way that is folded in. And it's this way of imbuing and seeing this gift of the natural world and natural state of being as the divine itself.
Music and art is so central, right? A lot of people look at Islam, including my upbringing, not from my family, but growing up in the Middle East, experiencing Islam in that very rigid, oppressive, exploitative form. But what's ironic is that if you hear the sermons, if you hear the recitations during prayer or the khutbah after Friday prayers, they're very musical.
Yeah.
It's very musical. And it's to this day, when I hear prayer, when I go back to Bangladesh or even here, I get goosebumps. Not because it's nostalgia, but because it is such a creative, beautiful song-like form. And here's you have the sort of even the most oppressive format of Islam using this without any understanding or even acknowledgement that, hey, we are actually singing a song here.
Yeah, I think, like, speaking of Islam and Sufism, look at Qawwali, right? Qawwali was a form of like religious outreach. You know what I mean? And talk about being able to convert anybody. I was hooked at 19. I remember heard a bit of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan growing up, but then I just dove, like hard dove in. And and the amazing elation that Qawwali can bring you to it's undeniable, that it's just infused in spirit and it stirs spirit inside you and makes it come alive. And like, it's really such a deep research into the ecstatic when we're looking at it, especially when we're thinking of those different ways of reaching consciousness and breaching consciousness. Qawwali is one of the ways that I've never felt more connected and more a part of everything, is like in the midst of a qawwal.
And what's interesting is, like, I grew up listening to Qawwali. I don't want to say I want to listen to Qawwali because I pushed it away. I'm like, this is shit. I'm full of shame. I'm just like, no, this is brown. This is too brown. I don't want to listen to it. It's too brown, right? I want to listen to like Western music and stuff. And then coming back to it, you're totally right. Breaching consciousness is such a beautiful way of saying it, because it's not a 4-minute pop song. It goes for hours.
It goes for hours. Because even Nusrat's recordings that we would get, they'd cut them off around like 15 to 20 minutes. You know what I mean? Crazy. The longer form of it. But then when I went and experienced it working with, so one of my projects was Jalak, which was like a Sufi hip hop hybrid. And I met this amazing family from Rajasthan, from Jaisalmer in Rajasthan, the Khans. And Sďwg, the eldest brother of that family and the kind of leader of that crew, actually studied with Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan Ji when he was a kid. Oh. And it's amazing. And you can hear him on some of the early Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan recordings. And to have that kind of thing come back around and meet these cats through Indian Summer Festival. Shout out to Suresh Rao for that connect. He brought us together and was like, hey, maybe you two work with these musicians who are coming to town. I was like, oh, yeah, I'll try that out. And I hadn't heard them or seen them. I'm just kind of game for collaboration. You might have got that sense from me. And we met, and they started breaking into these kawals. And I was beside myself, and there I am doing a little bit of beatboxing, and then I started doing a little bit of freestyling along with it as well. And then Sďwx was hilarious because I was behind my table in my little safe zone with my electronics in front of me, and he just like grabbed me and pulled me up from behind it, and then the only way I could explain that, like really the word that comes to the description is like touching the ecstatic. And like moving into the ecstatic, and it's a blur, but I remember I just felt like a kid in mud, that this was just like where I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. And then over the next 7-8 years, we went back and forth between here and India, getting to know each other more, working together more. And so I didn't start playing music till I was like 19. And like I was saying, I was in this deep dive of koala then. And one of my biggest dreams was that I would be able to just sit in the back of a koala and just be one of the clappers doing some backup vocals. And then fast forward however many years, maybe too many, and here I am in a koala beatboxing, rapping along with them, and like going back and forth. And it was such a dream project. So music really has this way of transforming our consciousness just by itself, when it's like felt so intuitively, when you really allow yourself to be immersed, when you allow yourself to go into trance, when you allow yourself to like really be moved and go through spirit that way. So I'm forever, ever grateful to that connection and being able to be within that. That's the other thing, like with our society, kind of the way it is now, and even these rigid boundaries we want to try and put next to us. Yes, like I grew up Sikhi, and I can find spirituality in everything. Like I can relate to folks in a koala. I can relate to bhajan. I can relate to like gospel. I can find God in all those places because I don't feel a rigid boundary that I can only find God in one way.
And that is what's both powerful and also most threatening to those powers that be, because you've disintermediated. You found your direct connection to God. And that's where art and music, I find in the most strictest cultures, whether it's political or religious or whatever, none of them like art or music. They say don't do it because they know exactly how powerful it can be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's a reason why the Taliban assassinated one of the Sabri brothers.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Wow. They put a hit out on him, and it happened, and it's terrible. And the reason is because there's power. There's power there to lift people. Yeah, there's reasons why the powers that be feel threatened by that.
You spoke about collaboration. You spoke about communal experiences. Spoke about transcendence. Let's switch gears and talk about your work and how you describe yourself as you haven't said this, but I'll describe you as that because my experience of you. You are really what feels like a catalyst to me. That's what I've seen. The week that we spent together on Cortez Island and you worked with our group, I saw you as a community activator, a catalyst, a spark, somebody who sparks the flame. Tell me a little bit about your approach to community activation. You're working with communities across Canada and India and elsewhere. And also, what is this idea of liberatory practice of creativity? I pulled this from your bio on your website, I think. What does this mean?
Man, I hate when people steal from my bio and then ask me to explain it. No, I'm just joking. Yeah, no, of course. So creativity has clearly unlocked so much for me in my life. And from an early time of feeling the power of that, I really wanted to have that happen for other young people as well. at the time, being a young person. Yes, totally. Forever young. Oh, yeah, this is a podcast. I don't have grace.
No, you're the guest. You can be whatever you want, man.
Totally. No, I'm happy to be the age that I am. These grays speak to great stories. So as a young person, I felt that strength of creativity within myself and what it had done for me and helped me through so many hardships in my own life that I wanted to make that also available for other young people that were going through various struggles. And so it was pretty early on. And it's interesting. I never thought this conversation was going to relate so much back to Sikhi, but it really is. The central tenet is seva, right? Which is how do we selflessly give to others and be honestly just contributing members of society towards the health and betterment of everyone. And because of that, I started to think about, okay, there's these forms that have really unlocked inside of me, like music and hip hop in particular. And so at a young age, I started just other people and working with other people. And it was felt quite natural to be within that. And I started first working for the Sarah McLachlan School of Music way back then. And there we were doing free music classes for inner city youth. And I was teaching percussion there. That moved on to become so many different things over a 20-year span of being involved with that school. And then I also started working with this organization called The Power of Hope, and where I met one of the dearest mentors of my life, Charlie Murphy and Peggy Taylor. And they really just took me in, along with a few other real dear ones. Shouts out to Nadia Cheney, shouts out to Sarah Kendall. And really pulled us in to show us what they'd learned in all this time of working with creativity and working with young people. And that was how I actually was reintroduced to Cortez Island. The first time I went there as a musician to play. And then annually I would return, once I started working with Power of Hope, to do the summer arts camps there for young people. And as Power of Hope grew, its influence and spread grew and became Pi Global Partners for Youth Empowerment, and started doing programs all over the place and connecting what Charlie Murphy called social artists who were working in a social capacity, using the arts as a tool for transformation and creativity as a tool for transformation. And around then, having learned some pedagogy from them, started to try and integrate it into my own art forms as well. And we started a hip hop literacy program in the local youth prison and worked with the young people in the youth prison there for years and years, and to an incredible amount of success with the young people, of course, because hip hop is a young person's language, giving kids the ability to express themselves about what they care about and really asking them what they think, not what the song that they like listening to thinks, but what did they think? And then having a room full of people who are listening to that has a powerful impact with anybody sharing their story. And that is at the base of it. The basis of that idea of creativity and liberatory praxis is when we look at, no matter where we're coming from, whether class, race, gender, sexuality, however we want to subdivide ourselves into those sections, we know there's a root to everybody. There's a story behind everybody. And if that story is listened to, especially in a deep way, and often art is a great way to tell that story, and a great way for us to be able to relate. And when we're able to do that, we build connection and we build, I would say, strength within that person, because they've been able to tell their story and a room full of people have held it. People are holding that story and also seeing their own connection with it. Once we start holding other people's story, we start to see connection. We start to see all these ways, and these ideas of how we would want to hate each other start to melt away. And so that is one of the kind of ways that it moves towards, I think, a liberatory praxis. And I think the kind of key with myself and the crew of people that I was working with and continue to work with is we try and bring those into marginalized communities, because those are the places where power is purposefully trying to either stamp out or take away. And when I think about power, I often think I'm always thinking about it on three levels. I'm thinking about systemic, interpersonal, and our personal power. And if we can, there's levels of systemic power where generational we can create change and we can like move towards stuff. Interpersonally, we have a bit of control over that, but our personal power is what's going to give us that ability to navigate through the world, to be able to center ourselves in our own magnetic north and move from that place. And so that's what I mean by that line from my bio. Sorry, that was a big ass roundabout way to say what I was talking about.
When I asked, I knew it. There was a very good story there, and I think that's really powerful. And to me, the most powerful thing about what you just said is that when you enable somebody to tell their own story in the way that feels the most honest, it actually turns all the source of their pain, stress, tension from this arbitrary, diffuse source to something that's now more tangible. And once your story becomes very obvious to you and very true to you, you can start asking, what other stories are we not telling? Whose stories is not being heard? And so then you start to question the real sources of power, like oppression and things like that. So
absolutely.
So talking about personal story and liberation, and not to put words in your mouth, let's talk about your most meaningful psychedelic experience.
Got to narrow it down to one?
Set of experiences, however you want to describe it.
Okay. This one's coming to mind. It's definitely one of the most powerful. And then I can equate it to something else as well, because I felt a very similar experience doing this as well. But I will not recall how old I was. I'm sure it's in my early 20s. And we are in the Walbrand Valley on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And I am nestled into the roots of an old growth cedar. There's a waterfall not too far from me. And that was my first time experiencing DMT. And inhale, lean back, and I hear what I think is a rock vibrating, the vibration of a rock. And then I start to hear the other rocks vibrating, and then the waterfall sound lifts up, and then the resonance of the entire place is building and building, and it's like rocket ship, whatever you want to call it. It's like we are in the astral planes. We are existing beyond time. We are existing beyond measure, really. And I strangely feel a sense of home. And I'm floating. There's various images and veils moving through me. I'm moving through them. And I get into a little conversation with a spirit, an entity, a reflection, however we want to label it. And very much just like having that feeling of being home. And I think, I'm like, do I stay here? And they're like, oh, no. Yeah, you have much work to be done. And then like with blessings, be on your way. And then it's a slow, beautiful come to, because I'm in one of the most delightful ecologies on the planet. And there's is that Terence McKenna who is all about the golden infinity?
Sounds like something he'd say.
Yeah, right. So that starts to really make sense to me. The idea of, because I remember a point of it feeling very golden, very like clearly feeling like a golden spectrum opening. And so that was probably one of the most powerful psychedelic journeys for me. And funnily enough, about a year later, I'm finishing a fasting period, and I am going back and forth between this beautiful cedar sauna and this creek out in the Kootenays. And within the sauna, I'm in prayer and doing mantra, and a very similar thing happens. And again, I feel this ripple of the golden infinity. I move into this expanse and vastness, out of time, out of measure. And so those are the kind of two like really heightened experiences that I was like, oh, this is an amazing correlation that's happening here as well. Which again, to me, speaks about the multifold path to divinity, that there's a million billion different pathways laid out, and you choose which one works for you.
They often say that if you do DMT, there's going to be a flashback later on, right? But in your case, I wonder, was it what came first? You sound like you're already primed for spiritual experiences, given your awareness of, let's
Hmm.
say, life or how things work or what's really behind the veil, that kind of a thing. So
Hmm.
were you more primed for DMT? Did Sikhism make you more primed, or did Sikhism become more meaningful because of DMT? It's hard to say, right? This is chicken and egg kind of thing.
Yeah, interwoven, you know what I mean? And if I think about that idea of an interwoven divine resonance, kind of sounds like that to me.
There you go, right? There is no
Exactly.
beginning or end. There's just the ever present.
Exactly.
What about it? And if you feel comfortable speaking about this, bad trips or challenging trips, rather.
Yeah, totally. Definitely. I recall, oh man, I think that might be Cortez again.
Mm.
Yeah. And we were up there I was hanging out with a bunch of pagans at the time. So we're up there for Samhain, which is like a pagan holiday that Halloween was superimposed over top of. And it's considered to be a time when the veils are the thinnest. And boy, did we cook up a lot of mushrooms. We made a decent vat of that. And I recall might have been a little bit too much medicine for the people. And I'm always of the ilk that there's something to be learned from any way that the journey goes. I try not to write it off as something that, oh, it happened as this freak moment because this thing or X thing was in the way. There's something to be learned there for me. But I remember we're in the midst of the forest where we're camping, made this kind of mushroom tea. We've all drank it, and then we're going to this particular place. Future reference, maybe wait till you get to the place. You know what I mean? Like things I would do now. I wouldn't necessarily be that smart in my younger 20s. But yeah, we're rolling to this place. And on the way there, it's delightful. We're walking through a dark forest and like light bursts are happening to show me the way out of the forest, trekking through. And it's quite dark. And we get to the place and we're hanging out outside. And I start to see this like dark, gray, purpley, like electric situation bouncing around on top of people. And I could see their body change. And then it was happening to a dear friend. And so I was just like, okay, I'm going to go give him a hug. I gave him a hug and tried to absorb it because that was a way that I could deal with bad juju or whatever. Is like I just absorb it and then I'd like meditate and bring in all that or all the like kind of strength that I know exists in the universe around me as well. And yeah, and it took me a long time and I felt this just like churning inside of me of this energy. And it took my mind to all kinds of dark places. And then there was an eventual pop that happened where it disappeared and the rest of the night got much better. That would be one. And then like I got involved with psychedelics as I would say as an escape route as a teenager for sure, out of circumstance. So there were some kind of rough acid trips because we were probably getting some dirty shit in the suburbs too.
Dirty suburban acid, yes.
Yeah, totally. And like I said, there's always things to learn from them. There's always things to like try not to like completely just deny them. Some pretty dark visions can come your way via those things if things aren't aligned in a way. And I think now I know where my place of psychedelics is. It's very much in the natural world. If I'm in the natural world, I'm like attuning to forces that are greater than me and that I'm less likely to feel these. I don't know. The whole idea of dark and light entities is a binary that I don't really buy into myself, but for description's sake, it becomes the way to talk about it. But yeah, now I really focus on like when I'm going there, what is the environment around me? Because as I was saying, this idea of interdependence, that we are indeed the world around us, then I want to prime that instead of it being like a suburb where nature is cemented over and the world is not necessarily in favor of that natural world. I try and bring myself into the natural world before I'm going into psychedelics. And that's the things that come along with grays, I think, is that now we set ourselves up in those environments.
That's a very interesting observation because I think when a lot of us decide to take these medicines or substances, we naturally are inclined to be in nature. But what is it about the urban built, chaotic city environment that actually feels very threatening, feels very hostile? And I think If you think about infrastructure as a superposition of the mind, imposition of
Hmm.
the mind, rather,
Yeah.
then you think of the urban environment as hostile because it's been built from that very consciousness,
Yeah.
alert, problem solving, practical perspective, which is detached, individualistic, right? It's all
Yeah.
organized. And it's not a bad thing. I know I would rather have street traffic lights.
Definitely.
But I think, when we open up our minds and to greater stimuli and we seek
Mhm.
the, let's just say, the natural programming that we've all been born with,
Yeah.
civilizational humanity, like human level programming that we've been blessed with, I think we want to go back to a resonance which is calm. It feels something just that's connected in a deeper way that we don't find in
Hmm.
our regular day-to-day life default mode of consciousness.
Definitely. And shout out to rave culture. And I was a little raver as well. So that's the place that I found like a safer place to in urban settings to explore psychedelics, but having the ability to like have pumping music and dancing and like visuals and like the whole thing being and quite a communal activity again is feeling interconnected in those spaces quite often. And then probably my favorite are this is like a West Coast favorite is bush raves, right? This is where the rave is actually situated in this natural place. And we're able to have the best of both of those worlds. It's definitely also been another place where I have been on various psychedelic journeys.
Raves have always been a refuge for outliers, outsiders, people who never felt part of a bigger community. And raves were
Mhm.
that thing. When they first started, there were these dilapidated buildings and warehouses and stuff, like places where
Mhm.
nobody would go because you can't. Developers are like, oh, this is a hostile place, whatever. That's where people went, and that's where you found community because everybody's an outsider. And when everybody's an outsider, nobody's on the outside. Everybody's on the inside. Everybody's part of that community.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Last weekend, just a couple of days ago. Oh, hold on. Today's Monday. 2 days ago. Um,
Yeah.
there's a festival that started, I think, during the pandemic or right before, called the Geary Art Crawl. And
Okay.
Geary Avenue, I used to live by there before I moved to Calgary 2 years ago, and I moved back now. It's like one of the last few places in Toronto that is still got lots of warehouses, lots of like mixed housing between industrial, residential, old multi-story, like low-income housing and things like that. People who've owned homes there for decades. And now it's because artists have been pushed out of every corner of the city. They're going in and occupying these warehouses, turning them to ice cream shops,
Yeah, yeah.
restaurants, artist studios. And so Geary Art Crawl is this long stretch of a street that was taken over for the weekend. And you had these crazy graffiti filled alleys full of raves. You had street art. You had all the wacky things. And the people it pulled in, it made me think, oh man, this is the true essence of a beautiful city where you have
Mm.
a sense of community, but also creative friction. It's not overproduced. It's not glossy. It's real. Like you can touch it, you can feel it. And that's what raves are. And you could replicate and emulate that in a lot of places. But I think just going back to your point about raves, I think a lot of people misunderstand it.
And again, you have this place where you are falling into trance to repetitive rhythm. You are following melody. You are with a group of people that are also wanting to go there. You're doing it over an extended period of time. I think they're both like reaching for the ecstatic, reaching toward this goal of the ecstatic.
Riz Ahmed has this line from one of his songs. He says, "From the mosque to the mosh pit." I love that.
Oh,
I
that's
love that
amazing.
visual. It is so
Oh,
close
that's
to me.
amazing.
Let's switch gears a little bit because I want to talk about the artist that you are now and why art is so
Hmm.
important. We are both very imbued in the psychedelic, let's just say, collage, for the lack of
Mhm.
a better word, in different ways.
Yeah.
But different people, depending on where they are, where they stand, they will say psychedelic movement, psychedelic sector, industry, ecosystem. Do any of these words resonate with you? And if not, or if they do, why?
I think more than any of that, the word culture might resonate with me the most. Mostly because it's a group of people with similar interests, whether that's traversing the heights of consciousness and seeking new forms of consciousness or seeking towards new forms of consciousness within yourself. 'Cause I don't know. Sometimes think we importancize ourselves a bit much, and we think a bit much of ourselves, that we're like transversing new planes and we're inventing these, we're tapping into higher forms of consciousness than ever before. And I'm like, are you though? Or are we a kind of another human manifestation of exploring consciousness and finding maybe a route that is very old and has existed within many societies for thousands and thousands of years? So that's maybe why I'm not super comfortable with industry, because it lloyds to the world of capitalism and free market. And me and you have gotten into plenty of discussions about that, so we won't rock your listeners with that right now. But I like the idea. I could live with ecosystem as well, because it's complexity. It's got a very diverse notion of how we come to it and how we might all still arrange ourselves to be able to create an ecology of thinking around it, as opposed to there's one straight capitalistic route to having an empire that sells psychedelics. It's going to be like Spotify for mushrooms. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I'd say ecosystem and culture are like the words that I would feel the most comfortable, because they encompass within themselves a wide scale of looking at it and a wide scale of interacting with psychedelics and psychedelic culture.
I like culture because into culture is this constant negotiation of values and the ways people show up, systems show up. And it's important that it's a negotiation, because negotiating future or interpretation of the present is multiple interpretations or multiple values, multiple realities, right? I always joke that you can't spell culture without cult. It's important that these are not cults. It's a culture, right? Okay, in the last sort of 10 minutes or so that we have left, I think it's really...
Wait, let's hang out on culture for just one more second here. Okay. Just because with all of that we are learning about mushrooms, and this is also a popular thing, and I would implore everybody who's looking at psychedelics as an industry to also learn from mushrooms and learn from mycelium and understand the woven, interconnected nourishment that psychedelics can be for humanity. That is my greatest hope, is that it's a place of nourishment and transformation for the age that we're living in, which is like, we've seen where the capitalist dream takes us, and it's not far. And we're looking at the ecological crises we're facing right now. And so please, if industry is the term that you use, please learn from these, because I think even if you relate to it as industry, if you relate to it as through a business framework, I think we can all agree that we are learning from these entities, these medicines. And if we can learn about mycelium and the interwoven interconnectedness, that is one of the greatest hopes that I have for the psychedelic culture and movement, is that it allows us to tap into a consciousness that's wider than the human network, that's more than human, that we're seeing how we are interconnected and affecting the ecology and the world around us, and what are ways that we can weave those in, even if you are coming from a free market philosophy and you're entering into this space, even if you're coming from a socialist perspective and you're coming into this place, even if you're coming from all these various perspectives. Let's see how we can weave these together for the betterment of humanity and not the betterment of stockholders necessarily.
Very well said. And I think just to add to what you just described here, ultimately, it would be really ironic that the thing that opens up your mind, you actually are holding on to. It's deeply ironic that people
it really is.
End up being more ideological, and that can happen. And so just to add to your point,
True.
Ultimately, we have to be open-minded. And that is not to tolerate bullshit. That does not mean you have to tolerate bullshit. It's like you speak up and you fight, but also ideology is what got us into this mess. Being able to see, to your point, the interconnectedness, the complexity, and we have to remain humble at the helm of things we don't understand. Even if you're a hyper rationalist coming from a pure scientific sort of perspective or business, To me, good art and good science, there's no difference because both
Beautiful.
accept the uncertainty and the limits of experience and knowledge.
And the question is the most exciting part.
Exactly. And that is what is truly beautiful. Like whether you are, when Sasha Shulgin was studying creating novel molecules, and the first time he created MDMA and MD, Sasha Shulgin experienced these things together with their friends. They weren't like, okay, I feel the molecules. They're like, wow, holy crap, my mind is capable of so much. How is that different from being on top of a mountain and being completely overwhelmed by the beauty and majesty of nature and things like that, right? So
Beautiful.
I really love the way you described that. Let's come back to ultimately the power of art. And I want to ask you, as a practicing artist that's so powerful and so well spoken and has a very strong conviction in the arts and culture, in this very chaotic, uncertain, just confusing time that we live in, what role does art and culture play? Whether it's in sense making, whether it's experiential art, whether it's immersion in something. Immersive art is everything now. But really, what role does immersive art and culture and storytelling play in this very hyper convoluted times we live in?
Big question. I think I'll break it down into scale. Let's start at the personal. For us as individuals, I feel expression can be a place of solace and birth of imagination. So we can find solace in the art we create, or we can find solace in the art that other people have created. It can bring us peace. It can bring us rage. It can be an exploration of the human emotions. And that's one of the, I think, most beautiful things about art, how it continues to be this extension of human emotion, whether that's from devotion to rage to ecstatic to joy to sorrow. Art really has an ability for us to extend either into us, into our emotional escape, or for our emotional landscape to extend out. I think and then when I start to think about weaving it and how its role in the world, I think of the imagine it. I think of the possibility, how it can really fold out possibility. It can give us new directions or new ideas. Ultimately, it's a tool in creativity. It can give us from goalposts for us to reach towards. If we're thinking about futurism and that side of art and how we're like trying to see a future where we can exist, to the present being able to connect us, be able to bring us together. One of the interesting things that I find sometimes is you can categorize, and it quite happened, bringing this full circle back to being in our teenage years, how we almost categorize ourselves around the music we listen to. And art can bring us together, but all depending, and it very much is a tool that way. And it's depending how we're using that tool. It can be used within whatever the intention of that user is. My hopes are that it's used to connect us more, to bring us closer to ourselves and bring us closer to this incredible gift of living on this planet. And it can be an expression of that and to draw people closer to that gift. And in my kind of most recent work that I'm working on right now called Polyphonic Garden, that is how I'm approaching through an audio, visual, poetic reach into exploring this feeling of being interdependent, exploring this feeling of being interwoven. And it's really interesting when we start to think about art and copyright and where that starts to exist, because, and that's the tension I feel inside a lot with myself lately, is how can I claim any ownership when there's no way this exists without the rest of my world? There's no way, like, all of a sudden there's this like individual bouncing around that the ideas are sprouting at, or no, I am rooted and interwoven in a community, in an ecology, in a planet that is asking this to emerge from me.
It's very mycelial in that you're a fruit of that connection at the most, and so am I, and so is all humanity.
At the most. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. So we're just trying to fruit over here, man.
Spotify of mushrooms is what I took away from this conversation, and that's going to be in the title.
I'm into it.
Ruby, when we spoke about you on the podcast, I knew it was going to be awesome, but this has surpassed what I expected. So I'm deeply grateful for your friendship and for your wisdom and your knowledge and the immense amount of creativity and poetry that you hold. Thanks so much for being here and spending the time.
Rod, it is such a pleasure getting to know you more and more. And I'm grateful can we put our paths to cross each other, and looking forward to walking those with you. It's a blessing to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim, again. And thanks, Ruby.
Big love, brother.
This podcast was produced in collaboration with Carolyn Tripp on art design. Thanks for listening to Minority Trip Report. I'm your host, Rod Siraj.